how's your phone?
I had my MRI yesterday morning, so I'll find out tomorrow.
Oh,
The ACL story.
I feel better soon.
Me too. It's a good thing I have undergraduates.
How you guys all doing? I might have to go into that room to take the phone. Today we're going to talk about language and brain decoding language. Do any of you work on language or language-related things? I'm just trying to think. I don't. Does anyone do language-related stuff? Not really. Okay. Well, language is sort of, language is an interesting area. That it's sort of kind of, in some ways, a bit separate from the rest of cognitive science, but for no good reason. I mean, this department is actually a very nice illustration of language and the rest of cognitive science actually coming together. But people often, it's amazing how you can study language and you can study the brain and behavior for quite a long time and not actually think about language very much. So, those of you who don't study language, which I guess is sort of all of you, how many of you sort of think that it's sort of an interesting question, like how language works, but it's just something that you've not actually ever really worked on? Or yeah, you see, there's an interesting thing. So everyone, a lot of people, language is one of these things which everyone finds interesting, but it's quite easy not to actually interact with much when you're doing cognitive neuroscience. Well, today we're going to interact with language and think about it. And it turns out that there's actually interesting things that have been done, especially just in the last few years. So we're really going to think about, the classic question, which is actually not, I would argue not really a particularly interesting question anymore, is which brain areas are involved in language? And you probably many of you have heard of Broca's and Wernicke's areas, which are named after kind of famous 19th century neuropsychologists who discovered patients with lesions in these particular areas, and these patients would have particular type of deficits. So I expect you all already know. Broca's area is just sort of around here, and if you have a lesion here, you have difficulty speaking, and Wernicke's area is sort of around here, and if you have a lesion there, then you have difficulty understanding speech. So that's a kind of very minimal approach to how does the brain represent language. But I think one of the main themes of this class has been just knowing that some area is involved, or knowing that some area lights up, is not really in and of itself hugely illuminating about how is the brain actually representing or processing information. So instead we're going to look at this question, how is language represented? And of course there's lots of different ways you could actually attack that question, because language has a lot of different things going on in it. So the very first step of language that all of us acquire as young children is being able to hear and understand and produce speech sounds. So that's something that people look at a lot. It's something I've done some work on as well. And then we have to start stringing these words together. So, I have a little 2-year-old boy, and he's just starting to produce, little strings of 2 or 3 words in a row. Most of his things he says are about trucks for some reason. So he'll say stuff like, "See garbage truck," and so he's discovered some basic sort of syntax of how to combine words together, and the question of how the brain achieves that is very interesting. But today we're going to talk a little bit more about maybe the most fundamental question, which is how do we figure out what anything means? And even just deciding what it means to say that a word means something is actually not a simple question. There's not even a universally agreed answer on it. But let's forget for a moment this kind of deeper question of what does it even what is meaning anyway, and let's just say can we figure out from someone's brain activation whether they're representing the meaning of a particular word. And you might view this as a sort of, this decoding in general it's sort of an interesting and fun thing to do, but you could argue that it's more than that. It's actually really a test of whether we actually understand anything about how the brain is encoding information. That's what we're all trying to figure out as cognitive scientists, cognitive neuroscientists. The brain represents this stuff, and somehow it does it. How does it do it? So if we really think that we can understand, that we have a little bit of a handle on how the brain represents the meanings of words, then we ought to be able to some degree, decode the meanings of those words. And for a long, long, long time, no one has ever really done that. And then a very important paper came along in 2008 that was published in Science, and that was, did I say that as one of the readings? I think I said that as one of the readings. The Tom Mitchell paper. If I didn't say that as one of the readings, I should have done. Was that one? Yeah, I think that was one of the readings. And what's very interesting is that Tom Mitchell is actually not a neuroscientist. Tom Mitchell is a machine learning researcher. In fact, he is the founder and chair of the machine learning department at CMU, Carnegie Mellon University. So he's not just any old machine learning researcher, he's like one of the most important machine learning researchers in the world. And now a big chunk of his time is spent doing neural decoding. So that's sort of interesting in itself. And that shows how these sort of branches of machine learning and pattern recognition algorithms and neuroscience are really starting to come together. You know that there's a bridge happening if like the chair of machine learning at CMU is actually doing this stuff for a living. So, and what's also nice is that their work has actually gotten quite a bit of attention, rightly so, and a very nicely made video has been produced by 60 Minutes. So let me show you some of that. Don't worry, although this is a 13-minute video, only about 5 minutes of it are about the Tom Mitchell stuff.
How often have you wondered what your spouse is really thinking, or your boss, or the guy sitting across from you on the bus? We all take as a given that we'll never really know for sure. The content of our thoughts is our own, private, secret, unknowable by anyone else, until now, that is. Neuroscience research into how we think and what we're thinking is advancing at a stunning rate, making it possible for the first time in human history to peer directly into the brain to read out the physical makeup of our thoughts. Some would say, to read our minds.
We'll discuss whether it is really
This is
reading
the
minds.
technology that is transforming what once was science fiction into just plain science. It's a specialized use of MRI scanning called functional MRI, fMRI for short, that makes it possible to see what's going on inside the brain while people are.
I walk into that scanner room
Sorry,
and
the
I
audio's
see the
not
person's brain appear on the screen.
This
When I
is
see
Marcel
those
Just,
patterns,
the main
it is
collaborator
just
of Tom
incredible,
Mitchell.
unthinkable.
Mind reading, what do you call it?
Thought identification.
Whatever you want to call
This is Tom
it,
Mitchell
what
on the right.
neuroscientist Marcel Just and his colleague Tom Mitchell at Carnegie Mellon University have done is combine fMRI's ability to look at the brain in action with computer science's new power to sort through massive amounts of data. The goal? To see if they could identify exactly what happens in the brain when people think specific thoughts.
Okay, are you ready to get started?
They did an experiment where they asked subjects to think about 10 objects, 5 of them tools like screwdriver and hammer, and 5 of them dwellings like igloo and castle, then recorded and analyzed the activity in their brains for each. You had them think about a screwdriver, and the computer found the place in the brain where that person was thinking screwdriver?
Screwdriver isn't one place in the brain, it's many places in
That's
the
a very
brain.
good point.
When you think of a screwdriver, you think about how you hold it, how you twist it, what it looks like, what you use it for.
And each of those functions are in different places.
Correct.
Just as when we think screwdriver, or igloo for example, neurons start firing at varying levels of intensity in different areas throughout the brain.
And we found that we could identify which object they were thinking about from their brain activation patterns.
You're reading their mind.
We're identifying the thought that's occurring. It's
Whoa.
incredible, just incredible.
Are you saying that if you think of a hammer, that your brain is identical to my brain when I think of a hammer?
Not identical. We have idiosyncrasies. Maybe I've had a bad experience with a hammer and you haven't, but it's close enough to identify each other's thoughts. So, that was never known before.
We asked if his team was up for a challenge. Would they take our associate producer, Megan Frank, whose brain had never been scanned before, and see if the computer could identify her thoughts? Justin Mitchell agreed to give it a try and see if they could do it in almost real time. So you've never done an instant analysis, as we might say on television.
Nobody's done this ever.
That's actually her brain?
That's her brain.
Inside the scanner, Megan was shown a series of 10 items and asked to think for a few seconds about each one. If it all comes out right, when she's thinking hammer, the computer will know she's thinking hammer.
Right. And we're all gone.
So Megan,
Yes,
how was it?
it wasn't bad.
Good. Within minutes, the computer, unaware of what pictures Megan had been shown, and working only from her brain activity patterns as read out by the scanner, was ready to tell us, in its own voice, what it believed was the first object Megan had been thinking
This
about.
bit of getting the computer to speak is pure gimmick, by the way, but the decoding part is not a gimmick.
All right, one.
Right. All right. Then the second.
I think the word is hammer.
All right.
I think the word is window.
It's perfect, right?
So far.
And it continued to be, word after word.
Apartment.
10 out of 10.
10 out of 10. Well done, well done. And of course, this is just the beginning.
Exactly.
Who knows what you're going to be able to read?
That's
A little
right.
scary, actually.
Well, that's our research program for the next 5 years.
What?
To see how, we're not satisfied with hammer.
And neither are neuroscientists 4,000 miles away in Berlin at the Bernstein.
Okay, so, you don't want to see my calendar, do you? There. Sorry. Okay, so that was sort of an interesting, news segment. I mean, that was actually from a few years ago. So, do you really think they were doing mind reading? We've discussed this a little bit, but I think this is useful to discuss a bit more. Do you really think they were doing mind reading? And if they weren't doing mind reading, what were they doing? And if they, insofar as they are doing mind reading, is there any sense in which they're doing mind reading? So what thoughts do you guys have on that?
What was the phrase he used when she said mind reading?
Oh yeah, thought identification.
Yeah, I like this better.
Yeah, well, okay, well here's an example. Here's the sort of thing I'm getting at. Okay, so so what, for instance, they might have two possible answers like igloo or hammer, right? So if I say, I'm the great Suprendo and I can read your mind, you could be thinking about anything, I'll tell you what you're thinking about. And, I have no idea what you're thinking about, and I'm like, seems to me you're thinking about what shopping you need to do at Wegmans tonight. Okay? That would be mind reading. Right? Now, if I say, you're either thinking of igloo or you're thinking of hammer, and I'm going to tell you which one, right? It's actually quite impressive, I mean, in my opinion, and this was really not something that people could do until relatively recently. It's quite impressive that just by looking at someone's brain, you could actually tell whether they're thinking igloo or hammer. Okay? But that's really not quite the same thing as a totally open-ended decoding process. Remember we were talking a little bit about, this was way back in the class, about if you're calling up one of these automated voice answering, voice responding services, and there's a very restricted set of possible things that it has to figure out what you're saying. Like if it's trying to figure out, are you asking for arrivals or departures at, say, an airport? It's going to be pretty good at telling whether you're saying arrivals or departures, especially because, for two reasons. First, because there's only two possible answers. And second, that's crucial. And second, because arrivals and departures don't really sound very much like each other. Okay? Whereas if you could be calling up and you might be asking about anything, then we still need a human being. Right? And occasionally you have these automatic answering services that do try to say, please in a few words tell me what you're talking about. And that usually doesn't work very well. You've probably all experienced frustration with that kind of system, right? So this exact same kind of distinction is between there's some word, who knows what it might be, there's some thought of any kind represented in your brain, and there's these two choices, and which one are we going to tell? Now, there's also actually another aspect, and this is not in any way to belittle this work, because this is very, very important work, and it totally deserves to be on 60 Minutes, but it's to kind of get more of an understanding of what's actually going on in there. Then there's another aspect that, which of these two questions would you say would be more difficult to answer by looking at someone's brain? Whether they're thinking, say the choice is between, say, a hammer and a pair of pliers, or between a hammer and an igloo. Okay, which of those two decoding tasks is going to be more difficult?
Between the two tools?
Exactly. Okay, so why would that be?
Well, presumably they sort of share more similarities in their neural representations.
Exactly. Okay, so and it actually turns out there was a very good reason why they picked tools, and this again is not in any way to belittle their work, because it actually shows a real understanding of how the brain is representing things. In fact, they help to show how the brain is representing things. So there's a real sound justification for picking these classes of dwellings, right, and tools, because it turns out, and Quentin, I know you know this stuff quite well, right, because you're working, there's actually tools, well, dwellings in particular, it's been known for a while that dwellings are sort of scenes, big things that we sort of move around in. It's not exactly clear, but some things like houses and igloos and windows and stuff like that are actually spatially laid out things, are represented in the part of the brain that's near to the hippocampus, called parahippocampal, it's often referred to as parahippocampal place area because it sort of represents places. And one thing that we've discussed quite a lot is these areas which some people sort of believe are entirely specialized for a single unique function actually tend to have lots of different things going on in them. But one of the main things that's going on in this area, probably a bunch of other things, is representation of places. And that's a kind of nice separate special-ish area. Maybe not as special as people think, but certainly, let's say it's a sort of focus of concentration of dwellings and places. And there's also, maybe not quite as localized, but there's also a sort of concentration in the brain for representation of tools, it turns out. Would you say that's a reasonable statement?
Yeah.
Okay. So in fact, Brad Mahone and his students work quite a lot on tools if you get interested in this. So notice that in all of the in the examples that they gave, it wasn't it wasn't, you know, hammer versus pliers, okay, it was hammer versus igloo. So there's actually a big between category difference between these pairs of things. So that's also worth bearing in mind. But you know, you have to also give them a lot of credit that that they were actually willing to take a new person. This is another thing that we've talked about a little bit, that the patterns in one individual person's head may not be the same as the patterns in another person's head. In fact, in the fine structure, they definitely won't be the same. So if you can find something that generalizes across individuals, then you've really gotten something that works quite well. So so that tools versus dwellings thing that they demoed on the 60 Minutes producer was actually an earlier study by them. But then there's a subsequent study that they did, the one that came out in Science, that we're going to talk about quite a lot more in just a minute. But first I just want to do another sort of demo. This is actually not a brain-related demo. If I'm about to show this, please stop me if I've already shown this. I don't think, have I already shown this demo in this class? I don't think so, right? Okay, so this is to sort of illustrate one example of not necessarily how your brain is representing, but how you as a human being represent the meaning of the words. And it's to show that we care about semantic similarity. Semantic is just the sort of cognitive science jargon term for meaning. Okay, so it's the meaning, similarity of meanings. So so this is just a sort of psychological demo. So I'm going to show you a list of words. Try to remember as many as you can. Okay, you all ready? They're going to flash up somewhat fast, but not crazy fast. Okay, got that? Okay, now here's the question. Okay, were any of the following words in that list? Oh, I should have put this higher up on the screen, right? Sorry. Okay, soft, short, sweet, smooth. Any of those words in the list? Any of them sort of feel like they were in the list? Yeah.
Sweet.
Okay, excellent. Good. Thank you. Okay, this proves that you have a properly functioning human brain. Well, it doesn't, but it shows that you're actually representing these words. All of you, actually, I can say with some confidence, are representing these words in a very similar way. In that probably, if any of these words seemed like it was on the list, it was probably sweet. Okay? Now, just to convince you that sweet. Now, because this is, as you probably guessed, this is the trick, because sweet actually wasn't in the list, but there were lots of words related to sweet, semantically similar to sweet, that were in the list. And I'm going to show the word list again in a second, just so you can choose it. And so this is actually called, I did not invent this, so this is called the Diess-Roediger-McDermott effect. This is a famous effect. People think of it often as an effect in memory, but it's also an effect because, you know, you're trying to memorize a list as it goes around. But it's also an effect of the representation of meanings, because it shows that you're representing things in terms of their similarities to each other, or at least it's suggestive of that. There's actually an interesting story that this Diess person discovered this result, I think in the 30s, and published it, and this paper lay dormant and forgotten for literally more than 50 years. And then Roediger and McDermott, who are like quite well-known memory researchers at Washington University in St. Louis, I don't know exactly if they just sort of independently invented it and then discovered that Diess had published it, 50 years before, or if they just found this old Diess paper. I'm not sure what the story is. But they published it, and everyone was like, oh, wow, this is a really interesting memory demo. And so now it's known as the Diess-Roediger-McDermott effect. But it was actually, one of the most interesting memory results that's out there was literally published and forgotten about for 50 years. So so you might kind of see this list of words in a slightly different light now that you know what's going on. So you can see how a lot of them are sort of related to sweetness or related to taste. So people have known for quite a long time that there's some sort of regularities, underlying regularities in how the brain represents the meanings of words, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you can actually go in there and decode them. So Tom Mitchell, who you just saw in that video, and Marcel Just and other colleagues came out with this paper in Science in 2008, and they really made a big advance in this area. And I'm going to sort of unpack what's going on in here. But one thing that's actually worth pointing out about this is especially nice is that they put all their data not immediately, but not long after they published the paper, they put all their data on the web. So it's one of these kind of publicly available data sets, and various other people, including me, have sort of played around with it a bit. So it's an interesting, it's both an interesting scientific result and a sort of nice service to the community that they let everyone else play with their data too. So this picture probably doesn't mean that much to you yet, so we're going to kind of go through exactly what's going on here. But before I do that, I just want to step back a little bit to when we were talking about the Jack Gallen work, which was also addressing this question. Actually, believe it or not, it doesn't look like it, but it actually takes a very similar approach. So that was looking at vision, and this is looking at words, but in a sense they're doing the same thing. So let's see if we can see what that sense is. So the sense is in which they're not just having learning a sort of pairing between particular brain activation patterns and particular stimuli. So a lot of decoding studies, in fact, until the Mitchell and Gallen work came along, I think all decoding studies were actually just saying, okay, here's this stimulus, stimulus A, here's the neural pattern for that. Here's stimulus B, here's the neural pattern for that. So all these different neural patterns and stimuli were sort of isolated, discrete pieces of data. Okay. But the world does not consist of separate, discrete items. The world is, a very continuous, distributed sort of place. So it's not, if I've learned about A and B, I can't be confident that I'm only ever going to encounter A and B again. I might encounter something that I haven't seen before. Now, if what I haven't seen before is something C, if what I haven't seen before is just completely different from anything I've ever encountered, then I'm just going to be stuck. And it would be I don't know if any cognitive system would be in a very good shape at dealing with that. You can, but if it's something that's sort of similar to what you've already encountered, then maybe you can use that knowledge even though it's something new. It's not so completely new that it's just impossible to relate it to what you already know. But in order to relate the new thing, to the stuff you've already seen, you have to have some sort of model of, well, what is the relation between this thing and the stuff I've already seen? So that's the key relationship between this Tom Mitchell work of looking at language and the Jack Gallen work of looking at vision. And that's what's nicely summarized in this picture that I also showed before from Krieger's quarter, where you have a bunch of different stimuli that have some set of relations between them. And if you can capture those relations, okay, if you can capture the sort of underlying structure of the stimulus space or the task space, whatever it is that you're trying to model, then you can try and figure out new stuff. Okay? So this nice kind of visual example is, I've got a bunch of different shapes. They might be like pointy squares or slightly rounded squares or circles, or they might be blue or kind of bluish green turquoise, or they might be green. So there's a sort of continuity in this space. So if I have something that's sort of an extra roundish square and sort of a greenish turquoise, then I can say, aha, it seems to have a set of relations to stuff I've already seen. It's sort of here in the space. I can interpolate in the space. And then if you have a model of how this space is structured, so in this case it's a very simple model, right? You've got color this way and shape this way. Then you can say, well, whatever the relation is according to my model between this new thing and the stuff I already know, I can predict that the neural activation to the new thing is going to have a corresponding relation to the neural activation for the stuff I already know. So, so in the case of the Gallen work, what they did was build a model in terms of the voxel receptive field. So the relationship between new stuff and stuff you already know is take this image, enter it into your receptive field filter bank, and see what comes out the other side. Obviously, you need something different for language, so we're going to see in a second how Tom Mitchell had a model of the structure of language. But first of all, just to kind of get more of an idea of the kind of tasks they were doing. So you already saw some of this in the video. So what they were presenting to people, this is a broader set than the tools and dwellings data set. In science, they had several different categories I'll show you in a moment. But they wanted to induce a sort of mental representation of these words in people's heads, so they actually sort of got as rich a stimulus as they could. So they used they show pictures and the word at the same time. They've subsequently done it just showing the pictures and just showing the words. It turns out that you get similar sort of results. And if for those of you who actually ever do this kind of study, it turns out there's a sort of super standardized and extremely often used set of pictures that have been studied to death called by these people Snodgrass and Wondervore, and that's this. So if you ever want to find pictures, so simple line drawings that absolutely unequivocally, unambiguously produce a particular concept in someone's head, then you can say, okay, we can use these ones. Now you may or may not want that, but so if you say, give me a picture of a dog that I know someone is definitely going to say dog, then you can just go and get this one, and then this picture actually does the job pretty well. So this is their stimuli, and they had quite a broad set of words. So they had 60 words. Can you read these from like that? Yeah, I think so. Okay, so they're all concrete nouns. Okay, this is an important point. That our ability to understand how language is represented in the brain was greatly advanced by this Tom Mitchell work, but there's still lots and lots and lots and lots of open questions. So first of all, these are all individual words. Right? Language does not consist of individual words. Language consists of lots of words all strung together. Right? How those words are represented when they're all strung together is a very difficult and interesting and open question that I and other people are trying to figure out. They're also all concrete. Okay, so the meaning basically these are things that you can hold in your hand, or if it's a big thing like a house that you can actually physically interact with. It's not abstract things like the election or the number 3 or name your favorite abstract concept, a university or something like that, right? So what were the different categories? So some of them were the ones that we already saw. So we've got buildings. So here's igloo, right? So we've got apartment, barn, church, house, igloo. Remember, the buildings are nice because there's a sort of relatively clear representation, at least of building, not necessarily of which building, but if you have a building-related word, it's probably going to be in this parahypocampial place area. But also things like animals, body parts. Here's those tools again, like pliers, screwdrivers, saw. Saw turns out to be a problem. We'll get to that in a minute. Things you can eat, stuff you can ride. Okay, so there's different categories of concrete nouns. And you can see there's a lot of relations between these words. This is really critical. Okay? So these are not just words that have nothing to do with each other. These are words that actually have quite a lot to do with each other, right? So, for instance, buildings and buildings parts, right? A house there's very strong relationships in meaning between house and door and window, right? Because houses have doors and windows. There's very strong relationships in meaning between, say, lettuce and tomato, right? Or tomato, you say in this country, right? They often go together, right? Typically in a sandwich. There's, oh, sorry. I apologize for that. There's very strong relations in meaning between the different vehicles, right? So like car and truck have a lot. So there's a whole set of semantic relationships between these words, and if we need to have a model of the stimulus space, then our model would do well if it captures what these relationships are. Okay. So how did they do that? So what they did was they had a set of verbs, 25 in altogether, that tended to be quite sort of concrete, physical, manipulation-y type verbs. Remember, these are all concrete nouns, things you can sort of touch or hold. So all of these nouns are represented in terms of verbs, like action verbs like push, move, taste. And then you say, okay, let's go out and look at big sample of text. In this case, they actually, so Tom Mitchell works with and gets funding from Google. And so Google said, hey, we have a big sample of text you could use. Okay? They have like the biggest sample of text of anyone. They have, actually this is publicly available now, I'm not sure if it was at the time. They have a text corpus consisting of 1 trillion words. Okay, that's a lot of text. So you can say, let's go through this set of 1 trillion words, and let's see how often our nouns, words like dog, celery, co-occur, meaning that happen close by in a sentence with these different types of action verbs. So for instance, you're much more often going to see the word celery together with taste than you are, say, going to see the word hammer together with taste, right? Okay. Whereas hammer would often be together with, push or pick up or bang or something like that. So they go through. So in fact, this approach of taking a big chunk of text and seeing how often different words go together with each other is a very, very dominant and important approach in trying to get computers to understand text. So in fact, this is actually sort of the stuff that Google is built out of, actually. And so if, sometimes you type in a term to Google and you sort of spell it wrong, or you type it wrong. And Google says, did you mean blah? Okay, it didn't, until a few years ago, it didn't do that, actually. When it says, did you mean blah, and actually you almost always actually gets what you did mean, right? That's because it actually has this model of how different words and different, ways of misspelling the word actually are related to each other. And similarly, if you have a couple of different words that mean the same thing, like say you want to look for, traffic conditions on the I-95 or something, right? You could type in traffic conditions I-95, or you could type roadworks I-95, or you could type in, driving delay I-95, and they would all get you to the same page, despite the fact that you've entered in completely different words. So Google has to know the road delay, traffic conditions, and construction work, at least in the context of a road, all mean more or less the same thing. So the way it does that, it does that using a lot of special tricks, but one of the main things it does is by looking and seeing how often these different words co-occur together. So traffic conditions and road delay, these words will all often tend to appear nearby to each other in blocks of text. So that, they scrape the web, get lots and lots of text off it, and see which words tend to go together. And so that's what they use for seeing what the relations were between these verbs and these nouns. So this is probably too low down on the screen for you to see, actually. So for instance, hammer, and then you just you assign that to a number. So you have 25 numbers, kind of normalized so they add up to 1, such that the bigger the number, the more often the particular word co-occurs with one of the features. So if you've got, say, hammer, it co-occurs quite a lot with break, so it gets 0.013. Even more with touch, not very much with eat, whereas celery has sort of the opposite pattern. So touch, you get a lot. Celery, you get a lot of relation with eat, not very much with break and touch. So this is a way of representing the meanings of these words using a set of features. And here's an example of that. So. So here's the words that co-occur with cat. And then actually it turns out that they were looking for co-occurrence within a sort of 5-word window either side. But you can you can also even look for whether they're in the same document. So slightly surprisingly, the word that comes up the most with cat is say. Say actually turned out to come out the most with lots of them. But lots of things that actually make a lot of sense show up. So notice they look for different forms of these words, right? Because you might say, the cat ate the mouse, or the cat eats the mouse, but those are still co-occurrences between cat and the word eat, so you have to look for the different forms of it. So cat often goes with eat, run, that makes sense, smells, and then as you go down the list less and less, and then I chopped off the bottom of the list because there's other words that it barely comes with at all. So that's sort of an example of how, so if you wanted to say, how am I going to represent the word cat in terms of these set of verbs here, where you say, well, cat has got a lot of say, a little bit of see, quite a lot of eat, not so much of these ones down here. So that's a sort of, this is what they would, in the kind of jargon term, is a semantic feature vector for the word cat. Okay. Now what does this have to do with brain imaging? Okay, so let's go back at this. So here's here's the basic idea. So you show somebody some word, in this case celery, okay? And that produces some activation. You know, it turns out there's actually sort of hotspot of activation in a part of the brain that actually represents the tongue and mouth, called gustatory cortex, because it's involved in tasting things. But before the Mitchell and Gallup type work, typically there wasn't this middle step. Okay, so you would go straight from celery produces this activation, and some other word, you know, apple would produce some different activation. But then if I say to you, okay, I know now I know the activation for celery. What do you think the activation for spinach is going to be, right? You would say, well, I have no idea because I didn't, you know, I never actually showed anyone the word spinach in the scanner, so I'm sorry, I can't help you there. Okay? Well, if you have a model of what spinach might be like in terms of celery, in terms of their set of semantic features, then you're not stuck. You can say, well, spinach is 0.9 times celery plus 0.1 times carrot plus whatever it is. Okay? And given that, I can predict that the neural activation for celery is going to be 0.9 times the activation for carrot and 0.1 times the activation for I can predict that the activation for this new word spinach would be some function of the stuff that I do know. So, so here's an example. Here's an example of what these semantic features actually look like. So recall that you're never actually directly measuring the neural activation to one of these semantic features, okay? Because nobody ever gets presented with one of the semantic features. Semantic features are the verbs, remember. Nobody ever gets presented with up on the screen the verb run, and then we look at their neural activation to that. The only thing they ever get shown are these nouns. But if you show someone a bunch of nouns and you know the degree to which those nouns co-occur with the word run, and you know the activation for all those nouns, then you can use that to estimate, well, what would the activation for run look like? And it turns out that actually, although one thing I really like about this paper, there's lots of things I like about this paper, but one thing that I really like about this paper is, Tom Mitchell is the chair of machine learning at CMU, so you might think he would use some incredibly elaborate and complicated sort of high-powered machine learning algorithm. It turned out they just use linear regression. Okay? This is often, the mark of when people really know their stuff is that they're willing to do something that kind of is very simple.